Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm going to give it another minute or so, and then we'll get started on the agenda. Thank you. Okay, hi everybody. I'm Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Income Housing Coalition. Thanks for joining today's HoUSed campaign national call for universal, stable, and affordable housing. I appreciate everybody joining. It will be another busy week ahead. We are expecting some time this week for the Department of Treasury to release its updated spending numbers on emergency rental assistance. And I'm expecting that at the same time, they may issue some new guidance or tools related to emergency rental assistance. We're also watching very closely, and we'll talk a little bit later about the federal eviction moratorium, which is now back before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court may rule on it as soon as this week, later this week. Congress is back for just a few days. The House is going to vote on the resolution on the reconciliation bill that could have over $300 billion in investments for affordable housing. So certainly we'll talk about actions that they are taking and that you can take to ensure that those investments include the HoUSed campaign's top priorities. And related to that, we are circulating, starting today, a new sign-on letter. We already have nearly 1,200 organizations across the country signed on to our letter for the HoUSed campaign priorities to be included in the reconciliation package. We now have some more specifics on the funding amount that we're requesting related to Section 8 vouchers. And so we'll talk about that later in the call as well. But Elena has just put in the chat box that sign-on letter. So I would urge you all to circulate that and sign your own organizations on if you haven't yet. So we're going to turn to our agenda. If you received the agenda via email, I'm unfortunately need to let you know that our first planned speaker from the Urban Institute is not able to join today's call. She had a last-minute emergency and had to cancel. So we'll get her on again as soon as possible to talk about some of the case studies that the Urban Institute has done to look at how communities have adapted their homelessness response system to respond to COVID-19. So instead, we'll turn now to talk about the new CDC eviction moratorium. And a reminder to everybody on this call, who I think you all know very well, that the moratorium is in effect and does cover about 90% of all renters throughout the country. But it's different from the previous one in that there are some specifics around who is protected, in which communities they live in, and how much COVID is surging in those communities. So Alicia Mazzara from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities is joining to talk about a tool that they and the National Housing Law Project put together to help all of you and to help tenants understand whether they live in communities that are covered by this CDC eviction moratorium. So Alicia, thank you so much for joining, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat to this tool that Diane mentioned. Obviously this tool assumes, right, that the courts do not strike down the current CDC eviction moratorium. And I'm just going to walk through it, and then I think we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end. But the reason we wanted to create this tool is because it is a little more confusing about figuring out whether your community is covered by the moratorium or not. Can we go to the next slide, please? Great. Okay, so as Diane mentioned, there is an eviction moratorium in place. and it is shaped by the COVID transmission level in a given community, in this instance at the county level. So the first thing to understand about this is that the CDC has a 4 kind of colored scale for how severe COVID transmission is in a given county. And that ranges from low, which is coded as blue, moderate, which is coded as yellow, orange, which is substantial, and high, which is red. And depending on where a county falls on that spectrum is going to shape whether they are currently covered by the eviction moratorium, and also if that rate changes, how that interacts with the eviction moratorium. And so because that change is a little tricky to understand, we created this tool to kind of walk folks through it. So if you have a county with substantial or high transmission, which right now is most counties, it's covered by the eviction moratorium as long as that moratorium is in place, or 14 days. I'll explain why it's 14 days or to the end of the moratorium in just a second. If you're in a county, what we think could happen is potentially if transmission rates fall, that creates a more complicated situation. Under the order, if the transmission rate falls to low or moderate and stays there for 14 days in a row, then the moratorium no longer covers that county. So can we go to the next slide? So we created this little flow chart to kind of help walk folks through the decision tree of, am I covered or not? It's pretty straightforward if your county is substantial or high, but things start to get sticky if the rate is bouncing around, or it's bouncing between moderate and low, or substantial and high. And so if you are in a county that's going into moderate or low, then it triggers the sort of second set of questions, which is how long has my county been in this moderate or low state? And if it's less than that 14 consecutive days, you're still covered until you pass that 14 consecutive day mark. But if it's been beyond that, then the county is no longer covered. The county will become covered if the transmission rate rises again. So it's a little confusing, but hopefully this chart will make it more clear. Next slide. Okay, so now that you understand the basic framework for how to determine if your county is covered or not, you actually have to go to the CDC's website and figure it out. And for folks on the call, if you want to hop on the CDC's county data tracker and do this together with me, you are absolutely welcome to. We've got a series of screenshots here that walk us through it. But basically, when you get to the website, pick your state, pick your county, and it will pull up that same, next slide, please. It'll pull up that sort of same 4-colored kind of ranking that I showed you before, and it will be very clear visually if you are in high, medium, low kind of range. So if you're in substantial or high, you are covered until either the moratorium ends, if it stays substantial or high the whole time, or at the minimum, if it drops to low or moderate, it's got to stay there for 14 days straight. So if you look up your county and it's substantial or high, you can basically stop here. You know kind of what the situation is. But what we want to talk through, next slide, please, is what happens if your county is substantial or moderate, or falls to substantial or moderate during the next month, assuming the moratorium remains in place. We will see. So next slide. All right, so this is where it gets tricky, because the CDC website is not really designed for you to look up historical data. But so, as I mentioned before, if a county stays in the moderate or low category for 14 days straight, then the moratorium could no longer cover that county. And so to understand where your county is in that time period, you need to be able to look at what the rate was in the past. And then you might want to track it going forward. So to do that, you keep scrolling down on the page until you find this little button that says View Time Lapse. Next slide. When you click View Time Lapse, it opens a second map for you. This map is not zoomed in on anything, so you need to find your county and zoom in on it. You can double click, you can use the plus and minus buttons in the corner, you can hold and drag the map around, but you'll need to zoom that map in onto your county. It doesn't recenter the map for you, which is not very user-friendly, which is again why we're on this call. Next slide. Okay, so in this example, we have zoomed in onto the county we want to look up, which in this case I'm going to be using Esmeralda, Nevada. Once you've zoomed in, next slide, you can use this little drop down at the top to look up data that should be going back for the last about 30 days or so. And this is going to allow you to look back, and every time you change the date on this little drop down, it will refresh the map. And if your county's transmission rate has changed, the county will change color, or it may not change color if it hasn't changed. And so what we recommend doing, next slide, please, is you can actually, write down a piece of paper, open up a spreadsheet, look up going back in time, starting from today, going backwards to see how long your county has been in moderate or low. And that will tell you either how close the county potentially is to no longer being covered by the eviction moratorium, or to confirm that it is not covered anymore if it's been more than that 14 consecutive day period. So it's not super user friendly. We have asked some contacts at the CDC if they can potentially make it easier to use, but right now this is sort of the best way we've figured out. Next slide. So we have a couple of other frequently asked questions in this tool. I will not go into all of them in great detail, but I do want to highlight this one because I think it's really confusing, and I think particularly for folks who are advocates, it has the potential, I think, to be misinterpreted. Is when you go on the CDC website, you'll see this little note that says time period next to all of the information, and the time period is for a 7-day period, basically the prior 7 days. And that has led to confusion where people saying, well, I looked up my rate for my county today and it's, moderate. So it was moderate for the last 7 days. And that's not accurate. You do need to look up each day individually to understand what that rate is. It is incorrect to apply that rate to the past 7 days. All this is telling you is this is just how the CDC calculates today's rate, is they use data from the last 7 days, but it does not apply to the last 7 days. So what we don't want, right, is say a landlord coming in and saying, well, it's moderate today and it was 7 days ago. Therefore, at some point, you're counting back incorrectly as to whether the eviction moratorium would be covering this county or not if you are accidentally applying the rate incorrectly. So we just want to emphasize you need to look it up for each day. And yeah, I'm seeing some things in the chat. It is confusing. Next slide, please. So we've kind of just found different ways to try and reiterate this because it's really confusing. It's changes between substantial and high and low and moderate that could either trigger potentially becoming covered or not becoming covered. But that sort of 14-day consecutive kind of tracking is really important, right? If you have a county where it's bouncing in between substantial and moderate, let's say it's moderate for 3 days and then it bounces back up to substantial, like that sort of counter about those consecutive days, that clock restarts, right? It's not that there were 14 days somewhere in this period, it has to be 14 in a row. So as long as you're bouncing back into substantial or high, you're going to be covered. But because of that, next slide, please. We really recommend tracking this and keeping an eye on it because 14 days gives advocates and folks potentially facing eviction a little bit of time, but it's not a ton of time. But there should never be a scenario in which it, is a total surprise because of the way that this order has been designed. So I'm gonna stop there and let folks ask questions because I think there may be some questions.
Great, thanks, Alicia, and thanks so much to you and your colleagues for putting this together. It is confusing, especially for renters to be able to know whether they're covered or not. And I think this is a very helpful tool. So thanks for doing it and thanks for sharing it today. There's one question that's essentially asking who's responsible for knowing this information. They're asking, are the states or counties being asked to monitor this and announce to their communities whether they are still covered, or are residents expected to track this themselves?
So I don't have a great answer to that question. I know we've been talking to the National Housing Law Project about how ideally this would be something that the courts themselves would track and make that public. But I don't think it's super clear like who the onus is on, which is unfortunate because it is difficult. And I think it's really challenging for renters to know if they're covered or not.
Yeah, and I would just add on that on the updated declaration form that the self-attestation form that the CDC put out related to this eviction moratorium, where the tenant is checking off whether or not they're eligible. There's a checkbox for whether they live in a community that's covered under the moratorium. Now that form is only a sample form. It's not required, but it's problematic, I think, that the CDC is suggesting that this be the tenant's responsibility. And we weighed in with the White House to urge that that checkbox be removed, that the last person who should be responsible for knowing this level of information is the tenant themselves, who are at risk of eviction. Alicia, there's another question here from Ruth Johnson, who says that in the city of Detroit has a higher transmission rate than the county in which it's located. And how would that be handled?
So my understanding is that the way the order is written, it's fully based on the county. So if there's a discrepancy where like the county is moderate and the city is substantial, I think the county is ultimately what would unfortunately decide. This isn't exactly good news, but the good news is that right now it is so high in so many places that most counties are covered, but that could change. But as long as it's either substantial or high in the county, you'll be covered. But unfortunately, there's not a distinction for city level data.
Okay, and I'm looking through the other questions. There's a couple of requests for the PowerPoint, which we'll be sure to send out to all participants and all registrants, along with a recording of the call. There's Leslie Strauss put in the chat box another tracker that people could look at and use. There's a couple questions about the moratorium itself, which I'm going to get to next. Here's another question for you, Alicia. What about people who live in rural areas with no access to the internet? How are they supposed to be tracking all of this?
I don't think you can if you don't have access to the internet, which is a big flaw. I mean, I think that's where I think tenants, like advocates and the Law Project and other legal aid services could really come into play, because, you know, this isn't published anywhere. So I think folks would need to get further help. And I do want to flag one thing about the Leslie who shared the other eviction moratorium, the tracker. My testing of it has been that it's right most of the time, but sometimes it's missing data for counties or it's not right. So it actually uses a slightly different method to calculate the transmission rate than what is used on the CDC's county website. So I unfortunately would make sure that you're double checking against the county website, because it's not quite the same and it could lead to slight differences as to whether the county is covered or not.
Okay, another question, this one from Susan Kolkowitz, who asks if the first 14 days in the month are moderate, but the last 16 days are substantial, does the tenant pay rent for 14 days or something else?
So they would be covered by the moratorium for the 16 days where it's substantial. I don't know the answer as to whether they should pay for the first 14 or not, but they're protected in the subsequent days in the month. So I think whether they've paid or not in the earlier part of the month should not matter as long as you are covered now. But I am not a lawyer, so I will caveat with that to say that I would definitely double check that with someone who is.
Right. I think all these questions just sort of point out the difficulty of this type of moratorium. Yep. I would just remind everybody that under the moratorium, tenants would be making all efforts to pay the rent, regardless of when and if they're covered, because the rent is still due. So rent payments should still be made, or of course, tenants should apply for emergency rental assistance if they can't pay on their own. Yeah, and somebody else just reiterated that, Cindy Daly as well, said the moratorium does not relieve the obligation to pay the rent. Absolutely. Okay, Alicia, I think that's all the questions for now. There may be more if you're able to stay on the line. There may be more that come in and that you may be able to respond to directly via the chat in the Q&A box. But again, thank you so much for your work on this, and thanks for sharing it on the call today. Okay, I'm going to turn now to talk a little bit about the moratorium itself and what's happening in the courts. So again, the CDC's new eviction moratorium is back before the Supreme Court already. And the Supreme Court may rule as soon as this week whether to, in effect, overturn the moratorium. So just as a reminder, in late June, the Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 vote to allow the original CDC eviction moratorium to remain in place, because at that time it was expected to be the last extension, or at least that's why Justice Kavanaugh voted to allow it to stay in place. He voted with the majority. It was a 5-4 vote, as I said, and he said in his explanation for his vote that he was voting to allow the moratorium to continue only because it was set to expire at the end of July, and because an extension was needed to, in his words, quote, for the orderly distribution of emergency rental assistance. So he also said that he would reject any further extension without clear authorization from Congress. So after that ruling, the administration essentially stayed silent. And it wasn't until 2 days before the moratorium was set to expire that the administration said Congress would need to act to extend it. Of course, there was a hurried attempt in the House to vote on an extended moratorium. That vote failed because all Republicans and about 12 Democratic moderates would have voted no on an extension. And then, of course, Cori Bush slept out at the Capitol Hill, and there was a lot of pressure on the administration. And they did extend. The moratorium itself actually expired for about 2 days, and then the CDC issued a new federal eviction moratorium on August 3rd. This moratorium that Alicia was just talking about that covers about 90% of renters in about 80% of counties in the communities that have high COVID-19 transmission rates. So immediately when the moratorium was put, this new moratorium was issued, the Alabama Association of Realtors, the Georgia Association of Realtors, both of them backed by the National Association of Realtors, again started to work through the courts seeking to overturn the moratorium. So first they went back to U.S. District Court, Judge Dabney Friedrich, who on August 13th denied a request from the realtors to rule the new CDC eviction moratorium illegal. She said that she, as she had before, she agreed that it was, in her view, illegal and in the view of the plaintiffs. But she said that she felt that her hands were tied because previously the appellate court, a court higher than hers, had maintained the stay on the previous moratorium. So the realtors took it to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and on Friday, the U.S. Court of Appeals also denied the request from the realtors to lift the stay on overturning the moratorium. So on Friday night, the realtors took their challenge to the Supreme Court. They put together a 40-page filing that they submitted with the Supreme Court. They reiterated all the same arguments that they made in June. They suggested that they believed that Congress, that the CDC didn't have the power. And at one point they said that they felt that the eviction moratorium isn't needed because, quote, 59% of the eligible population is vaccinated. And I think it's very much worth noting that both Alabama and Georgia have spiking COVID-19 cases. Several hospitals in both states are out of ICU beds in both regular and children's hospitals. And both Alabama and Georgia have spent less than 3% of their emergency rental assistance funds. But still, they filed this emergency petition with the Supreme Court on Friday night. So the request, as it did last time, went to Chief Justice Roberts. He handles the emergency petitions, appeals that come in from the District of Columbia. And he moved very quickly this time. He instructed the Biden administration to file its response by noon today, which they have. And now that the response is in, Chief Justice Roberts can act on his own, or he can refer this to the full court and they will respond. And I think it's notable that the Chief Justice is moving much faster this time than he did last time. The first time when the realtors filed this emergency petition with the court, Chief Justice Roberts gave the administration about a week to respond. This time, the petition came in on Friday night, and he only gave the administration until noon today to respond. So they could rule at any time. The administration's response makes a very strong case for why the eviction moratorium is still needed. They make many of the same arguments and cite many of the same studies that they have in the past that show that increased evictions are associated with increased spread of and deaths from COVID-19. And they note in it that while their previous extension of the moratorium was meant to be the last, they say, and this is a quote, "The trajectory of the pandemic has changed unexpectedly, dramatically, and for the worse." And they note that as of August 19th, the 7-day average of daily new cases is nearly a tenfold increase over the rate when the court ruled last. So in other words, they make the case that the circumstances are very different now than when Justice Kavanaugh made his statement and the court ruled. And so they should similarly, really consider the new need for this federal eviction moratorium. So now we wait to see when and how the Supreme Court will rule. But I think, again, if the Chief Justice is moving quickly to request a response from the DOJ is any indication, I think they may rule more quickly this time than they did last time. Last time it took them about 2 weeks after they had all the papers before they responded. This time I will not be surprised if they respond as soon as the end of this week. And so there's no telling how they'll rule. I think there's a lot of guessing all of us can do, but we won't know until they actually rule. We do have to be prepared for the possibility that this time they lift the stay and allow for the lower court's ruling to overturn the moratorium to take effect. So the question then is what happens next? Because there are still 6 million renter households who remain, 6.5 million households who remain behind on rent and are at heightened risk of eviction. So the first question, of course, will go to Congress and whether Congress will act. And I think it's possible that the House could try again to pass an extended eviction moratorium. But even if they were able to do that this time in the way that they weren't last, we still come up against the hard reality that an eviction moratorium can only pass in the Senate if there are 10 Republicans who vote to extend the moratorium. And I don't believe there's a single Republican senator who would be willing to extend the eviction moratorium at this time. So it's a very hard road ahead for any kind of congressional eviction moratorium, even through a reconciliation package where it's the Democrats voting on their own. It's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to get this kind of a policy initiative included on a spending reconciliation bill. So we are, again, as we have before, urging that states and cities act as quickly as possible, both to put protections in place to protect renters, to put in place state and citywide eviction moratoriums, to put in place off ramps from the eviction moratorium, like some states have done, prohibiting evictions if a tenant has applied for emergency rental assistance for as long as their application is pending. putting in place right to counsel and other kinds of protections for tenants, and certainly for states and cities and counties to do much more and better and faster at getting their emergency rental assistance out to the tenants who need it to stay housed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up a little bit later in the agenda. But we will just have to wait and see if we are continuing also to work with the administration to urge them to do more to make it easier for states and cities to spend this emergency rental assistance. And we are, through our RACE project, working in a whole host of ways to encourage and enable and empower and push states and cities to do more. So if you have continued ideas for us about what more we can be doing in that space, we welcome them. We'll certainly continue to monitor and keep you all up to date on when the Supreme Court rules, and we'll send a call to action out immediately when there is a ruling. If they lift the stay, we'll include in that call to action all of the actions that we think need to be taken at the federal, state, and local level. So I'm going to take a look and see if there's any questions here. Maureen was asking about that quote on the trajectory of the pandemic. I think instead of trying to find it now, I'll ask Elena if she can put, she probably already did in the chat box, a link to the DOJ's response. And Maureen, that quote is in the first, it's like on page 4 or 5, it's early on in the 40-page document. Let's see, some questions about emergency rental assistance, which I'll just hold them for now, and my colleagues will be able to respond to those a little bit later. Somebody's asking about why all the focus on extending the moratorium if it stands on such unstable legal ground instead of pressuring the Treasury to update guidance to get the funds out fast. How about we do both? The federal eviction moratorium has been a lifeline. It has been essential, and it has kept tens of millions of people who otherwise would have lost their homes during a global pandemic stably housed during it. And it's more important than ever with the Delta variant surging and with hospitals filling up and stretched beyond their capacity already. We can't allow for millions of evictions to proceed. At the same time, certainly at the National Income Housing Coalition and all of our partners across the country have been working hard for over a year to get emergency rental assistance funds to the tenants and landlords who need it. So we will continue to push for both. Let's see. There's more, there's questions about whether there's enough money. Somebody says 6 million families times 6,500 equals 39 billion. The funds are there and then some. Yes, exactly. Again, as we've been saying from the beginning, the emergency rental assistance funds, the $46.5 billion that have been provided are very likely enough to cover all of the rent and utility arrears that tenants accrued during the pandemic. The problem is that the money is getting out much too slowly and it's not reaching tenants in time. So again, states and cities, there are some states and cities that are doing very well. There are some communities that have spent 100% of their funds. There are many communities that have spent 50 to 80% of their funds. But there are still about 15 states that have spent less than, I think it's 3% of their funds. That's as of the end of June. So there are, you know, and the cities and states that are doing it well, I think make the ones that aren't all the more glaring and unacceptable. So certainly more needs to be done to get this money out better and more quickly. A couple more questions on ERA specifically, which I'm going to hold for later. And so I think that's, let me just check in the chat box. Yeah, some questions about how to work with the courts. We can talk about that in just a little bit. Okay, and thanks to Elena for putting all kinds of helpful links in the chat box for everybody to take a look at. So I'm going to pause there. Again, we'll talk more about the emergency rental assistance in just a moment. And hang on just a second. Okay, sorry about that. You know what, Elena, I cannot seem to find my agenda right now. Who is next on the agenda, please?
Sure, I believe Jesse, are you next to speak? I don't have my agenda. Jesse, great. Jesse from Miriam's Kitchen is here to chat about DC. What's going on,
Great.
DC?
Thank you, Elena. Sorry about that, Jesse. I lost my my agenda right just for a moment.
Not a problem.
Worst
Thanks so
possible
much
time.
for having me.
Thanks so much for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Sounds great. I'm gonna do my best to summarize about 6 years of organizing into 5 minutes. So bear with me if I talk fast, but I think we should have a slide deck. And I'm excited to talk with you all about how we got DC to tax our highest income earners to fund lots and lots of permanent supportive housing. A little bit of background, Miriam's Kitchen is a social services agency in DC that's been working to end chronic homelessness for about 38 years. And we run a coalition called the Way Home Campaign, which brings together about 110 partners and about 6,000 individuals to end chronic homelessness in DC. And we work primarily on budget advocacy because we believe that budgets are tools to reverse decades and centuries of racialized capitalism, and believe they're an important tool in getting the funding needed to end homelessness. And we've been working over the past 18 months with a local under 3 campaign to enact a tax increase to fund vital social services. So we can move to the next slide. And just to give some DC context, DC has the highest per capita rate of homelessness in the country. So I know we're in the news a lot for national stuff, but we also have a local homelessness crisis. And DC also has, or had, after we made these changes, a really inequitable tax structure. So the top 20% of our wealthiest earners pay less in taxes than the bottom 80% as a share of their income. And there's a huge racial justice component to this work. We know that 90% of people earning over $250,000 in DC are white, which is exactly contrasted with the fact that 90% of people experiencing homelessness in DC are Black. And we know that that's not a coincidence, but the result of systems and oppressive systems that keep people homeless while other people profit from the pandemic and all sorts of things. And our goal in this work was not to go back to a pre-COVID level of homelessness. That was not good enough. Our goal remains the North Star of ending homelessness and ensuring that all of our neighbors have the housing they need to thrive. We can go to the next slide. And we really believe that tax justice is integral for racial justice. In DC, we work collectively with the Just Recovery DC campaign. And we were able to do lots of research and see that the average income of white households is more than 2 times higher than the average income of Black households. So we know that tax justice is integral for bringing about racial justice, and in our minds, ending homelessness and housing justice is an integral step towards repairing harm and building stronger and safer communities. And we believe that housing is really at the forefront of that. So another great visualization on the next slide. When we talk about taxing the rich, we're not talking about people making $60,000 a year. We're talking about people making over $250,000 a year, really just 3% of DC taxpayers. And in DC, 90% of people making more than $250,000 are actually making more than $1 million. So what we asked people to do, people making lots of money to do, was to pay about the cost equivalent to about 3 Starbucks coffees a month in increased taxes. And that, that funding was really used to reinvest in communities that need it. We believe that DC's growing prosperity should be shared equitably and fairly for all of our neighbors, not just hoarded at the top by a select few. And this was really a way to enact that. So we can go to the next slide. We worked with polling firms as part of our strategy, and 80% of DC voters supported raising taxes. So we were able to go to our DC council and say, look, this is common sense. This is stuff that 80% of constituents want. And we won. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about what we won. So in our budget advocacy, and we can go to the next slide, we won about 2,307 units of permanent supportive housing for individuals and 540 units of permanent supportive housing for families. You can see the rest of the numbers on the page. In addition to housing investments, DC expanded our earned income tax credit for more than 40,000 households. And now DC will match 100% of EITC starting in 2025. We were also able, thanks to the hard work of the Under 3 Coalition in DC, to increase the pay of early childhood educators so that they're paid in a parity with other educators. So through this work, we were able to fund $170 million in local recurring funding, which is really going to be a game changer for how we think about homelessness, how we think about early childhood education, and how we think about poverty reduction in the district, all just by taxing 3% of our voters. On to the next slide. Just a recap. So half of these vouchers that we talked about were funded by this tax increase. So we were able, this is the most funding for permanent supportive housing that the district has ever had. And this actually pairs pretty well with what our ask was of ending chronic homelessness. So this is a needed investment that's going to get DC back on track to meeting our shared goal of ending homelessness. And I want to close with a few key takeaways. This conversation was informed by many different things, including lots of organizing and advocacy over the past 6 years. But 3 things really stood out. COVID and the racial justice uprising really changed the conversation about how we should fund budgets, the role of tax policy in racial justice, and what it means for everyone to feel, or what it means for everyone to have the housing that they need to be healthy and thrive. And then in DC, there was also a marked increase in homeless encampments. We know that one specific homeless encampment near the Department of Treasury has grown by over 400% since the pandemic started. So we know that encampments is on the mind of our local elected officials, and we're able to say, you know, the humane and cost-effective and best solution for ending encampments isn't continuing to harass people, but it's to get people in the housing that they need. And by funding this tax increase, we can fund the housing that get encampment residents into housing. But we only won this because it was a multi-issue package. Had it just been funding for housing, we would not have won. Had it just been funding for Under 3 funding, we would not have won. So it shows the power of coalitions and coming together to work on broad issues to bring people together. And because we were able to work well with our partners, we were able to have wins for different campaigns through the same funding mechanism. This was with notable pushback from business lobbies. They were quite animated and quite vocal, but through grassroots lobbying and hard work, we were able to beat them and really take a modest approach to tax changes and leverage our tax code for justice. And the influx of federal funding really did create some significant challenges. Many of the council members were using the increase in federal funding to say that we don't need to increase taxes, we're flush with cash, we're all set. And we reminded them that the federal funding was largely one time, and DC, and that the goal wasn't to get back to a pre-COVID level, right? We wanted to end homelessness for as many people as we can, and thanks to this funding, we were able to end homelessness for 3,500 households. And this is just the start. We know we have to do more to end homelessness, to invest in housing justice, to clear DC's backlog of 40,000 households on our housing affordable waitlist. We're excited to look at taxing wealth, taxing property ownership. We're excited to take this success and show what we can do when we really level the playing field for all of our residents and make sure that our Black residents who built the city and whose ancestors built the city have access to the capital needed to thrive. So we're really, really excited in DC. Our next big step is getting all of these vouchers out the door, and I'm happy to take any questions and would love to see this idea emulated in other cities, because we know that local policy change really often gets the goods, and this is a great way to do it. So happy to take any questions if folks have any.
Thank you, Jesse. Such great work. Really, many, many congratulations and thanks for your leadership and your work on this. People are excited. The chat box is filled with kudos and thanks and inspiration. Laura Lama says, wow, that's amazing. Chelsea Heyman says, this is great. Kudos DC. Wow, amazing work from Nick Thompson. Judy Perlman says, astounding. Emily Matty, amazing. It goes on and on and on. So please read all of the thanks and the kudos. Peter Sabonis is asking for specifics. He says, what was the tax? How much did it raise annually? Was it earmarked? Is it permanent?
Sure. I was going to include a wonky chart that I left out, but I'm happy to send it offline, Peter, that has a good breakdown of the specific tax changes. We were able to change some tax categorization around to fund this by adding a new tax bracket and shifting some tax brackets around, but it is all permanent. And when the tax hike becomes fully operable, it'll generate $170 million a year in local recurring funding. So it is permanent. And then we were able to use the budget legislation to make sure it went to permanent housing and under 3 education workers.
Great, thank you. And Esther is asking if there's a link that they can use for their cities to emulate. Of course, we'll share around the PowerPoint that you have, but anything else you want to recommend that people take a look at, or if you want to put something in the chat box, either works.
Sure, I just direct folks to the wayhomedc.org. It is a small team, so our website is not the prettiest thing in the world, but that has our contact information and ways to sign up and see our blog and everything like that. And I see a lot of comments about, I wish our city had the political will to do this. DC did not used to have the political will to do this. We've tried this for years and years and years and failed. Or maybe just didn't succeed. But this year, really due to our long-term relationships with elected officials, but also the narrative changes brought by the pandemic and the uprising for racial justice and local elections, we were able to finally tip the scale to tax justice work.
Great, and it just goes on and on. So many people really excited and inspired by your work, and putting kudos in the chat box. Putting in contact information. I'm looking to see if there's any more. Esther is asking if you are willing to be a guest speaker at other events. Others saying that they are happy to get the wonky stuff too. So any additional information, if you want to share with us, Jesse, that we will be happy to share out with all participants. There were a couple questions about whether DC has, what other housing programs DC has. One person is asking if there's a housing choice voucher program to use vouchers for home ownership. And I think there was another question on whether there's a tax on empty homes that's used for housing and homelessness. So anything else you want to say about some of the other initiatives that you're working on?
Sure, both great questions. DC does not use Section 8 vouchers for home ownership. We used to, but that was before my time, and I'd love to see us get back to that. But DC does have a home purchase assistance program that is pretty well funded by the council. And DC does not have a vacancy tax that is used to fund housing and homelessness directly. It goes into our general fund. But those are the sort of creative things that we're thinking about moving forward. We know that DC does have enough vacant apartments to end homelessness for a lot of people. So we're excited to see how we can continue to leverage tax policy to make sure that everyone living in the nation's capital has the safe and stable housing they need to thrive. And I am going to do my best to try to copy all of these email addresses, but also please feel free to shoot me an email. That's probably the easiest. And I look forward to being in touch with everybody. And thank you, Diane, and the whole team for all the incredible work that y'all are doing and continue to do.
Great. Thanks so much, Jesse. Thanks again for joining and for your great work.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to turn now to our next topic on emergency rental assistance. And I'm going to ask for Sarah Gallagher and Emma Foley from our ERASE team to end rent arrears to stop evictions to share latest updates and tools. So Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Diane, and thanks, Jesse, for that great presentation. That was really inspirational. So I want to take a little bit of time to dive into some of the state and local strategies and program administrator strategies that Diane alluded to before when we talk about the potential end of the moratorium this, if it happens this week or if it happens in October. It really is an all hands on deck approach between now and whatever date that is to ensure that programs are accessible, that they're visible, and that they're preventive, and really getting the emergency rental assistance out to those households and landlords that need it as quickly as possible. So I'll do that, and then I'm going to hand it over to Emma Foley on our team to talk a little bit about some of the spending updates and what's happening on the numeric side. So as I'll preview some of these strategies, and I'll just open an invitation either in the chat or folks have, I'll put my contact information in the chat to let me know of other strategies as you're, working on your state and local level that have been effective in really creating visible, accessible, and preventive programs, because we're building this is as we go. So from the state and local policymaker side, we really are recommending that they act now. As Diane mentioned, most of the counties are in the red at severe or high levels of COVID. And so we want to make sure that all counties and states are prepared to extend their moratoriums or to create state and local moratoriums if and when the federal moratorium does come to an end. So really working with your governors and your state and local policymakers to ensure that those tenant protections are in place and are in place now, so that they're ready to go when and if the moratorium on a federal level is lifted. We have seen, based on the data from past weeks and months, that spending through ERA and distribution is starting to have an uptick. We've seen over the months that disbursements are, more or less doubling from month to month, which is wonderful news to see that uptick in the disbursement of funds. However, that is not quickly enough to meet the October or a deadline sooner than that, if it does come about, to really assist all households in need. As of the end of June, around $3 billion of the $46 billion in emergency rental assistance have been spent. So we really want to ensure that that continues to be in an uptick as we go forward. So we need to do more, we need to work faster, we need to make sure that programs are streamlined, that they're low barrier, and they're that really using the best practices and get Treasury guidance to ensure self-attestation, to ensure direct to tenant assistance, and other strategies that we know are working to get the money out the door as quickly as possible. The other thing is we want to ensure that there's safeguards in place that during the eviction process that ensures time for landlords and tenants to both apply and to access emergency rental assistance. More and more, as if courts do open up and the eviction proceedings are happening, we want to make sure that there are strategies in place that are aligned with the court system and with the ERA program to really have those processes running in parallel and talking to each other. So we want to make sure that eviction hearings are postponed, or that there's time for renters to apply, that if landlords are filing an eviction, that information is given immediately to the tenant that this is happening, and that both tenant and landlord are referred to mediation services, and that there are strategies in place that prohibit eviction while the assistance is, for the time frame that assistance has been given, to really ensure that those strategies are working hand in hand. Lastly, or fourth, probably not last, so we want to make sure that there's additional renter protections. Diane had mentioned right to counsel legislation. We've seen several states enacting and funding legal aid through ERA, so we want to make sure that right to counsel legislation is in place, or counsel is provided to folks who need it. Also, developing and implementing policies that could seal eviction records for people who are maybe evicted for non-payment of rent during the time of COVID, to make sure that there's preventative measures that won't cause future harm, even if an eviction does take place now. Next slide. So in addition to state and local partners, ERA programs can really start to ramp up their efforts, as I mentioned before. With the possibility of state and local courts processing and hearing a greater number of eviction cases, we really think it's crucial that ERA program administrators engage with attorneys, judges, justices of the peace, and court staff, and really see them as active partners in connecting landlords and tenants to the assistance they need, and really creating that open line of communication between ERA and the state and local court systems. There's several strategies we're recommending that ERA programs use to make this happen. And these are strategies that should really start immediately and not wait until eviction moratoriums are lifted in the future. But these are strategies that you can really lay the groundwork for right now. The first is increasing communication. We really know that that there are households that might be in the queue already for eviction. They may have had a filing that's on hold, and ERA programs should really understand who those folks are and really be able to proactively outreach to them. We should ensure that, as I mentioned before, that courts are modifying their summons and information documents, updating their websites to have ERA program information, links to applications, linked to phone numbers or housing navigators they can call that can really assist them with the housing navigation and ERA process. We also want to make sure that communication happens so that if someone has received assistance, the court knows that that has happened and that they could stop that eviction from moving forward. So if a landlord has been paid in full or made whole, that the court knows that, and the ERA program is communicating that in order to prevent that eviction from happening. Third strategy that is really, we've seen a lot of impact from when it's implemented is just being present in court, ensuring that there's some staffing either virtually, if court is virtual, or in person, if courts are meeting in person and it's safe to do so, to be there to provide applications on site, to provide that mediation and that reassurance that the ERA program is a real moving process and that landlords and tenants can access and can put an application in on that day. Really, that presence allows for both landlords and tenants to know about it, but also the court staff and judges to know about it and create that problem solving, that answering questions, and that collaboration that's needed to ensure it's successful. So being present is there, building those relationships with your core system. Related to that, we talk about fast tracking applications, ensuring that if there is a crisis where someone might be evicted in the next day or two or week, that application is followed up on. It's not just sitting in a queue somewhere waiting for documentation, but there's a proactive housing navigator or ERA staff person working on it, fast tracking it to make sure it's paid out as quickly as possible. So that brings us to the fifth point here. That's going to take some increased staffing. We're really encouraging now, as we were in the past, but now particularly to increase staffing for the programs. Make sure you're using your administrative and your housing navigator allocations to hire the staff you need to create the infrastructure to make the programs work. They don't work well unless they have the staffing they need to implement them. So making sure that you have that staff and you're utilizing those allowable lines to do that. Lastly, we've seen very high success in contracting with local community-based organizations to do a few things, to reach out, to provide outreach and engagement to the most marginalized populations, and maybe population-specific CBOs, maybe an organization that works with youth or works with an immigrant community in a specific part of town, really contracting with local CBOs to do outreach. But that doesn't have to stop there. They don't only have to contract to do outreach, but you can also contract to do the housing navigation support, the case management support, and in some cases, they can even help with the disbursement of funds. So they may be able to you can provide an allocation to disperse funds quickly to those populations that have the most barriers to accessing that funding. Next slide. So we want to, the third area we want to just sort of highlight as we're talking about this is that if the eviction moratorium does end, folks will be at higher risk of homelessness or of housing instability or housing loss. So it's extremely important now to be connecting ERA programs with these service systems that can really support the most marginalized households for the long term. So recommending connecting program processes and resources to your local continuum of care and coordinated entry processes, really ensuring that there's a system in place if somebody does experience housing loss, that you're able to quickly rehouse and provide a path to housing for that household. For families or households or individuals that may have longer term needs, that may need intensive housing stability supports, they may have a history of chronic homelessness or a disability, that you're connecting to other service systems and community-based organizations that can provide that support for them. And then, like I mentioned earlier, providing the coordination, the case management, and other support services that will help with long-term stability. Next slide. So there's a few resources I wanted to highlight as we're talking about this. One is our ERA checklist. I think I mentioned last week that that is now live and it's online, and you can access it from the NLHC website. So please use that. You can print it. You can use the checklist to really look at your ERA program and see how it's meeting the different strategies that we think or have seen have been able to create visible, accessible, and preventive programs. These checklists, they'll allow you to dive into each of the areas of ERA programming and to really make quick assessment of the program. Does it have the components that are really crucial for success? Is it really meeting the needs of the most marginalized? And then it'll provide you with some attributes and some case studies or examples of how to really implement that within your programs, and offer strategies for both yourself if you're an administrator, or strategies if you're an advocate or a tenant that you can then offer to your program for program improvement. So we make sure to download that, use that locally with your local program or your state program, and let us know how it goes. If you have any questions about it, let us know. We're happy to talk through with you and to provide any additional resources or examples if we have them that could support implementation of any of the areas that are in the checklist. And then next slide, we have a new resource that actually just came online I think on Friday. It's a documentation guidance for establishing self-attestation. This is the newest resource we have, which will goes through the different areas where self-attestation is applicable, and provides the guidance of what definition what eligibility means for that different component, be it income or COVID hardship or having a lease or having arrears. And I'll talk through when you can use self-attestation, and it'll provide links to examples of different forms for self-attestation for that specific eligibility criteria. So super simple chart with helpful guidance and links to actual forms that you can use as a program administrator, or you can recommend and share with your program administrators to really make the documentation requirements as minimal as possible to get the funding to those who need it most. So take a look at it. If you have any feedback, feel free again to let us know. Let us know how it goes using it. And if you have need for other tools and resources, also pop those in the chat, and we're happy to work on creating those and getting them out as quickly as possible. Now, the last thing I want to make sure to remind folks is that last week we concluded our webinar series on visible, accessible, and preventive programs. We're very excited to have concluded that. We had around 1,000 people on each of our webinars. So they went extremely well. Those are all available on our website in our resources section under meetings and webinars. So you can view those at any time and make sure that you have access to them. And all we ask too is, again, let us know what else you need. We're going to be putting more resources together, more opportunities for collaboration and information sharing. So there's specific topics that came up either through the webinars or that you've had on your mind, let me know, pop them in the chat, and we're happy to work to provide that for you. So Diane, I see you've hopped back on. Should I hand it over to Emma, or would you like to? Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks. I'm actually going to pause for a moment so we can hear from our next guest speaker from FEMA, and then I'm going to come back to ERA and to Emma. So Emma, I'm going to ask you to hold off just for a few minutes. I'm going to thank Sarah for your overview, and let Sarah and Emma and others from NLHC's Erase team know that there's a lot of good questions in the Q&A and the chat box that maybe you can answer via Q&A in chat. Otherwise, we'll come back to it a little bit later in the call. But I do want to turn now to our guest speaker from FEMA, who is here to talk about non-congregate sheltering reimbursement. And for those of you who are on this call, many of you have been working on this issue for a long time and know that after natural disasters, FEMA's public assistance program is typically used to reimburse state and local governments and eligible nonprofits for a portion of the costs related to emergency response. When it came to the COVID-19 pandemic, FEMA, for the first time, I think, modified their guidelines for the program to allow for federal reimbursement to the same entities to house either individuals experiencing homelessness, people with disabilities in non-congregate sheltering, so typically hotels or motel rooms, as a safer place for them to be able to quarantine or be safe from COVID-19, because the congregate shelters were shown to really facilitate quick spread of COVID-19, putting shelter residents at high risk of eviction, complications, and in worst cases, death. So FEMA reimbursements allowed for some states and cities to really quickly set up hotel room programs, decrease overall shelter populations, and prevent further spread from COVID-19. But one challenge for some communities to be able to do this was that FEMA only covered a percentage of the costs, and communities needed to pay for the rest. So on January 20th of this year, President Biden issued an executive order that increased the rate of reimbursement, including non-congregate sheltering, to 100%. This was really good news for a lot of communities, and that order was set to expire at the end of September. But last week, President Biden extended that through the end of the year. So we're really happy to have today Keith come back to our national call. He's been on several times before to talk more about the reimbursement and the process. Keith Torrey has over 20 years of emergency management experience, first at the state of Massachusetts, and then in many various positions at FEMA, including his current position as Assistant Administrator of the FEMA Recovery Directorate, managing the agency's response to declared disasters and emergencies. So Assistant Administrator Torrey, thank you very much for joining today. I'll turn it over to you to share some remarks and then hopefully answer a few questions that come in. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Diane. Appreciate that introduction. Appreciate you having us back to the call to be able to provide some information about our programs and where we are. That was a great opening summary of a little bit of the background. I'll try to cover some of that as well. First, I just want to say thank you to all of you for giving me the time, but also for everything that you're doing each and every day. I know throughout the pandemic, there have been multiple entities in many different roles and many different missions that have been working hard to do everything possible to support Americans in dealing with the pandemic, whether that be through medical care or non-congregate sheltering or those experiencing homelessness. There's just an immense amount of effort that's going on. FEMA's been committed to that from the very beginning. As Diane mentioned, our public assistance program, which is more traditionally used for natural disasters, became essentially the primary funding source for COVID response in the early days. Of course, there's been supplementals that have been passed since then to provide additional resources. But we provided just over $80 billion so far in assistance to state, local, territorial, nonprofit entities that are working to fight the pandemic. And as Diane mentioned, since January 21st of this year, that's been at 100% cost share. So what I'll go through a little bit of the background briefly just to make sure everyone's caught up. But as was mentioned early on in March of 2020, recognizing the circumstances of the pandemic and having the national emergency, which was then later replaced by individual major disaster declarations by state. But once the funding was authorized for emergency protective measures, for measures taken to protect life and safety, we did issue guidance to our regions that they were able to approve requests for non-congregate sheltering as a protective measure against the pandemic. That included both isolation and quarantine of those that were either positive, suspected to be positive, needed to be isolated and couldn't otherwise do so, and those that were at risk populations that couldn't adequately socially distance. So that effort was initiated early on. Initially, as mentioned, it was at 75% cost share. It was made 100% retroactively by the president on the 21st of this year, January 21st of this year. So that funding has been available since the beginning of the pandemic. The cost share again has been adjusted. There is one thing that has been a point of confusion is we have never had an end date for that assistance. We've always been providing that assistance as needed. The cost share had an end date of September 30th of this year, and the assistance in terms of when at any cost share that would be available has not had an end date. It's open-ended until such time that the pandemic no longer creates a risk. What the president did last week on the 17th of August was extend that 100% cost share to the end of this year. And so this is at now to 12/31/21. We're still at 100%. There is no determination at this point as to what will happen at the end of December of this year. We'll continue to evaluate that, continue to work with the White House on what the president may decide to do in terms of continuing of either the assistance or cost share. But that's where we are at this moment. The other thing I wanted to mention too was that the president also in January of this year authorized us to pay additional operating expenses for eligible facilities. So we, in addition to paying for the non-congregate sheltering, we also have the ability to pay for operating expenses for eligible facilities, which is those run by an eligible applicant, state, local government, tribal government, or eligible nonprofit. And that can include things like PPE, testing, disinfection, screening, et cetera, to be able to operate a shelter. And so what the two main activities that are, for those of you on this call that are working hard to protect those experiencing homelessness, the two activities that fall under our programs that you're either utilizing or may be able to utilize are the non-congregate sheltering, of course, and then the operational costs for operating facilities that you're responsible for. What this president's announcement also did, the announcement last week, was extend the 100% cost share for the opening and operating cost back to the beginning of the pandemic. So they're having a couple different policy movements, but if you take one thing away, bottom line where we sit today, all costs for opening and operating and all costs for non-congregate sheltering that we're otherwise eligible are at 100% from the beginning of the pandemic until December 31st of this year. So that's good news. It gives us more of an opportunity, of course, to continue to support you all as we are unfortunately all dealing with the Delta variant and the increase in cases. We all hoped that we would be at a different place here at this time of the year, but we are fully committed, and I know you all are, to continuing to fight the pandemic and protect those that need protection. And that's what this extension of the 100% cost share allows us to do. One just last thing to comment on before I take questions. One of the things that I've mentioned earlier was when our assistance will transition, when either the cost share will transition or the assistance for FEMA may no longer be available. Just to be clear, there are no dates set for that. There are no end dates for assistance being terminated in terms of no longer being available. The cost share does have a 12/31 end date at this point, and they'll continue to be evaluated as we get closer to that point. But I do just want to point out that FEMA assistance is under the authority of the Stafford Act, which authorizes us to take actions to protect life and safety against the pandemic. At some point in time, we will get to a point where the risk of the pandemic is such that these activities are probably no longer justified. Just like you, I don't have any sense of when that will be. Right now, we're focused on doing everything possible to fight back on the pandemic. But I just want to flag for you all that as you all are working with those that are experiencing homelessness, and as you're working to help transition folks to more stable housing, we are fully partners in the effort to protect folks from the pandemic. There will come a time in which obviously your mission of helping those experiencing homelessness will continue, and hopefully the fight against the pandemic will end at some point. I don't know when that will be, but I just want to flag for you all that that's the authority we're operating under, and so we should all be looking forward to what that transition might look like. We'll of course share as much information as we can. We have been working closely with our partners at HUD to be able to work on some guidance and some direction, and to make sure we are synced with their funding and their programs on how those that are using FEMA funding might transition to other funding sources at some point in time in the future. Again, I want to make sure I'm crystal clear, no date for that, not imminent, not anticipating it in the near term, but something that eventually we'll all have to work together on when and if we get to a point where the risk of COVID and the pandemic have subsided. So that's what I've got. Again, good news on the extension of the 100% cost share until December. We will continue to work with the White House and work with all of our partners on evaluating as we move forward, and of course keep you all posted on that as we get closer to that point in time. But with that, I will pause and see if there's any questions for me. Happy to take some questions.
Great, thank you, Keith. And it is very good news. Thank you for your work on this. And thanks to the president for the executive order. We've been waiting for some time, hoping that there would be some formal guidelines, released guidance from FEMA about the 100% cost share, and also about in the original executive order there was the possibility of states and cities getting forward payment for some of this non-congregate sheltering. Can you say any more about how the forward payment works and whether and when FEMA will put out more guidance related to 100%?
Yeah, so from a guidance perspective, the executive order that came out on the 21st essentially directed FEMA to pay for these opening and operating costs that I mentioned briefly. And we issued a policy in April that it laid out what we would pay for. The guidance on non-congregate sheltering from the beginning of the pandemic, which includes an FAQ and a delegation of RAs, is pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. That still is in place. We also have other guidance on how to apply, how to get assistance, how to get an account in our system. Those are all available. But when the president issued the direction to support opening and operating, we issued a policy implementing that in April of this year, and provided the eligible activities, all of which fit within all of the other COVID guidance we have, again, about how to get an account, how to apply, what's eligible, et cetera. In terms of advanced funding, so what we have done with states and applicants that need funding quickly is we were able to do what we call expedited PWs. That essentially means if an applicant has a need and they don't have a full sense of exactly what the costs are, we can work very quickly to obligate 50% of the value of what they think they might need while they continue to fully develop their plans. And that funding can be put out there very quickly. I would say that one of the misconceptions here is that ultimately the states have their own responsibility for cash management and their own requirements for when they can advance funding. There are provisions for it, essentially when a cost might be incurred in a minimal amount of time. It does vary a little bit state to state. And so that's a long way of saying we can get money obligated to a state very quickly if they identify a need. And then the applicant needs to work with the state on whatever their advancing procedures are or what their cash management procedures are. I hope that helps.
It does. Thanks, Keith. Another question is whether state level emergency declarations potentially expiring or changing will affect FEMA's decision to continue accepting the reimbursement requests from those states and cities.
Yeah, good question. No, there are states that have let their emergencies or their declarations expire. There is no formal connection legally between our assistance and those declarations. There are requirements at the front end when a state first receives a declaration of things they have to do, but there is no connection between those. So some states have already changed, modified, let expire their COVID declarations. That is not impacting the funding availability from FEMA.
Oh, that's great. That's really good to know. That's been a concern in some communities. Another question about whether the requirements for showing the need for non-congregate sheltering has changed at all since earlier in the pandemic.
Not directly. I think we put some guidance out, I think early in the process. Again, we tried hard, and you can hopefully appreciate the challenge of knowing there's a range of circumstances. We tried hard to allow flexibility for it to be driven by state, local, or other applicable health orders. And so really what our guidance says is that non-congregate sheltering is available for, again, those who need isolation or quarantine or those that are at risk. That has to be documented by a local health order that identifies the actions that are being taken to protect those that are at risk. And so that's led is to a lot of flexibility in how that might play out. Candidly, I'll acknowledge that has led to some different approaches being taken in different states, and sometimes the way our regions engage on those specific products that sometimes lead to perception of different answers. We're trying hard not to have that not be the case. But at the end of the day, when our expectation was to try to provide as much flexibility as possible for the local health officials to determine what's appropriate, we left that guidance pretty high level and are working that individual applicant with each individual applicant at the regional level. So that's kind of where we are. We still, of course, there has to be a justification for why those particular individuals are determined to require non-congregate sheltering. But the high level guidance from the beginning of the pandemic is still intact.
Okay, and related to that, Keith, where or who should nonprofit subgrantees for managing non-congregate shelters go to if they need additional clarity related to FEMA approved costs and reimbursement?
Right. So if you go to the FEMA website, one thing we've done in this disaster, backing up for a second, is or this pandemic, we've allowed direct application. And so what we typically do is we'll work through FEMA staff. We deploy to a disaster area. They'll get assigned to applicants and work through it. But in this case, obviously, that wasn't going to be possible with the scope and scale we were dealing with. So if you go to the FEMA website and you go to the COVID-19 page, you can find the link for our grantee.gov portal, and where you can put in a request for it to be considered for public assistance. That's the first way to just to make sure that your interest is included. If you're looking for specific questions about eligibility, it would be your state emergency management agencies or your FEMA regional office is where you can get that help, and that information is also on our website.
Great. And then last question I'll ask you for today, Keith, is a question that comes in from Jerry asking whether FEMA will report on the leading and lagging states in accessing and dispersing funds, and whether there will be an evaluation of the effectiveness of the program.
There absolutely will be an evaluation of the effectiveness of the program. We have a number of reviews that are going on, even currently, some internally, some from the Inspector General and other oversight entities. So definitely will be lots of reviews of efficiency and effectiveness that will come. And I'm sure we'll learn a lot of lessons from what we've done here about how we might be able to do better in the future. As Ann mentioned at the beginning, this was really an unprecedented thing for everybody, but also for us. We had to pivot the way we run our normal program at a scope and scale we don't normally do, fund activities we don't normally do. I'm certain there's ways that we can improve that for the future, and we'll continue to look for that. In terms of reporting on states that lag, I think we're working closely with each of our states to understand what it is their needs are. We're also starting to have a conversation around deadlines for submission. And I say that in the context of we haven't had any programmatic deadlines for submission of costs. We've provided a maximum amount of flexibility for how when costs can be claimed. Part of what we're looking to do now is figure out what's a logical, practical, and workable way for applicants to get those costs identified and claimed, and ultimately in the system funded and reimbursed if they're eligible. So more to come on that. We're going to do some consultation on that too. We're very mindful of the wide scope and scale of applicants we're dealing with, and we want to make sure we hear from everyone on what's possible and what is the considerations might be around that. So we're going to continue to monitor and evaluate the program, and of course work with the states to make sure we're doing everything we can to help funding get to where it needs to be as quickly and efficiently as possible.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Keith. Really appreciate, again, your work on this and your partnership in it. And I appreciate you joining today's call. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us, and let us know what else we can do to support.
Okay, thanks. Take care.
Bye.
Okay, now I'm going to turn to Elena Calabro from NLIHC's policy team to share the latest from Capitol Hill on advancing our long-term housing solutions. Elena, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Diane. All right. Hi, everybody. So House lawmakers returned to Congress today for a brief interlude in the August recess to hold a procedural vote on the budget resolution, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. If the House passes the budget resolution passed by the Senate on August 11th, it will set the stage for a $3.5 trillion infrastructure and economic recovery package, including an investment of up to $332 billion for housing and transportation. So a group of 9 moderate Democrats, House Democrats, are threatening to vote against the budget resolution unless the House first votes on the bipartisan infrastructure package that the Senate approved earlier this month. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi has remained firm in her position that the House needs to pass the budget resolution before voting on the infrastructure package. And the Biden administration continues to support Speaker Pelosi's timeline on the budget and infrastructure. Several moderate Democrats may vote for the rule tonight, but still oppose the budget resolution. But some others have suggested that passing the House, the rule vote tonight on the budget resolution is not even a sure thing. So we'll be keeping a very close eye on what's going on in the House tonight and tomorrow. So as you may recall, the budget resolution calls for more than $332 billion for housing and transportation investments in an infrastructure package, which could allow for robust housing investments in line with or even above the $318 billion proposed for housing programs by President Biden in his American Jobs Plan. The Senate and Banking Committee and House Financial Services Committee are drafting up legislation right now to divvy up these funds among the various housing and transportation programs, which means that right now is the time for us all to be taking action. Because once the House releases text, it's difficult to see any major changes to the allocations that they make to different programs. So we do have a few weeks to make the greatest impact that we can. So there are a few steps that we all need to be taking right now during the rest of August recess and throughout fall to ensure that housing is getting as robust an investment as possible. So first, we're recommending that you sign on to our House campaign petition and share it with your networks. So right now we have more than 1,000, I think more than 1,000 organizations that have already signed on the letter so far. So if you're not on the letter, we please encourage you to sign on and share it, because the letter is one of our most effective ways to show Congress the broad support that there is for the House campaign's long-term policy agenda, as well as our priorities for the specific bill. So we did release a modified version of the House campaign letter. I'm not sure if somebody already put it in the chat box, but I can definitely do that. So while the core principles of the letter, the language explaining the reasoning for it are the same, our asks are now targeted to reflect the bill's scope, as well as the funds allocated to the relevant committees. So just a few changes. I know I'm running short on time, I'm sorry. But the updated letter adds a specific dollar amount to our rental assistance asks, in investment of $180 billion in rental assistance, which would be phased in over 10 years. This could help an additional 2.65 million struggling households afford rent. And if it's targeted to those households with the greatest needs, this amount could end housing insecurity for households with incomes below 15% of area median income, as well as households receiving SSI with incomes below 30% of AMI. The updated letter also adds a specific dollar amount. We ask for at least $70 billion for our public housing preservation ask. And we also request at least $45 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund, which we did not specifically mention in the original letter. The revised letter also excludes 2 of the list items from our original letter. We omitted the Emergency Housing Stabilization Fund and renter protections because the reconciliation process only allows for the passage of legislation that impacts the budget. Also, just to note that organizations that have already signed on to the original House letter will be automatically added to the new letter, but you will have the chance to opt out. The second thing we encourage you to do is to contact your members of Congress and urge them to include the House campaign's priorities in any infrastructure bill. Because while we have the top line numbers for the House Financial Services and Banking Committees, there is no guarantee that they will design their bill to prioritize the households with the greatest needs. So it really depends on us continuing to put pressure on members of Congress to focus on the housing solutions that serve people with the very lowest incomes and those who are most marginalized. So please just keep up these conversations. You know, we did create a media toolkit that includes talking points, sample op-eds, and social media messages, which I can also put in the chat. So that's it, Diane. I can throw it back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Elena, and thanks for covering the new sign-on letter, which, as Elena said, we're really urging all organizations to sign, and for you to please circulate it to your networks to get additional organizations to sign. We have nearly 1,200 organizations signed on. We changed, we adapted, we updated the letter to meet this moment. So our long-term goals remain the same for the HoUSed campaign. We have this incredible opportunity in the next couple of months, maybe few months, through this reconciliation package to get over $330 billion in housing investments and to ensure that they are targeted towards the lowest income people who have the greatest and the clearest needs. So our ask for public housing of $70 billion for capital repairs remains the same. $45 billion for the Housing Trust Fund remains the same. Both of those are about that, are proposals that both President Biden and Chairwoman Waters made in their legislation for an infrastructure package. And we have been calling for essentially universal housing vouchers for all eligible households. Given the allocation that we have for housing now, we're putting a number to that amount, which is $180 billion phased in over 10 years. And as Elena said, would help over 2 million households get vouchers and get or stay stably housed. So it's a really exciting moment. The committees are starting to work on the legislation now, and it's going to move very fast in September or October. It's going to move very fast, or it's all going to fall apart. We'll see what happens. We're rooting for it moving very fast. But again, if you're not signed on yet, please do that as quickly as you can so we can get that letter up to the committees, to the broader members of Congress to keep advocating really strongly for these funding levels to be included in the reconciliation package that moves soon. So before we end, I want to turn it back to Emma and ask her to give a brief update on spending for emergency rental assistance, and to remind anybody, if you do have to leave the call, I hope you can stay on, but if you have to leave, the calls are recorded and we'll be sending out the full recording after the call. So Emma, thanks for your patience, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So I just wanted to provide a quick update of emergency rental assistance programs and their progress. So right now, NLIHC is tracking 492 emergency rental assistance programs funded by the Department of the Treasury. The overwhelming majority of these programs are still open and accepting applications, but about 4.5% have now closed. Over time, we've seen an increase in the number of programs implementing program flexibilities like self-attestation and direct tenant assistance, but it's still not enough. For example, approximately 57% of programs now accept at least one form of self-attestation, but many applications are still burdensome for tenants. Only 28% of programs explicitly allow direct tenant assistance when landlords refuse to participate or don't respond to program requests. We do hope to see this increase in the coming weeks as more programs start spending ERA2 funding, which requires programs to fund tenants directly when landlords do not participate. Next slide. A recent update to NLIHC's dashboard is also that we now have a spending tracker to track ERA1 funds that have been spent or obligated. As Diane noted earlier, unfortunately, funds in many states are not getting out as quickly as they need to. And out of the $25 billion allocation for ERA1, NLIHC is estimating that approximately 21.5% of funds have been approved or spent. This will likely increase in the coming days as the Department of Treasury is expected to release spending data for the month of July, which will be incorporated into this spending thermometer. The thermometer is updated weekly, and we will eventually also update it to show ERA2 numbers to track the total $46 billion allocation. The thermometer is just a snapshot though, and at the bottom of the tracker, there's a hyperlink to a Google spreadsheet with some more disaggregated spending data. Next slide. So this more detailed data we introduced last week, or 2 weeks ago, but didn't have too much time to dig in. So I just wanted to highlight this new spending resource. The resource can be found at the shortened link here on the slides, but we will also post a link in the chat. The spending tracking resource has 3 data tabs that report on the amount of ERA funding paid or approved under several different categories. The first sheet has data aggregated together for all programs where NLIHC has spending data recorded. The data is reported as a whole and is also broken up by state, localities, and territory programs. Right now, we're estimating that approximately 23% of state funding has been spent or approved, and approximately 29% of local funding has been spent or approved. The second sheet has data at the program level for all programs that host a real-time data dashboard. This currently includes 40 programs, but we're adding new dashboards regularly. And then finally, there's a spreadsheet with the most recent data available for each of the state ERA programs. This data reflects spending for the state level program and doesn't include spending for all ERA programs within a state, such as those that are run by localities or tribal entities. The resource also compares how states are doing graphically, ranking their spending from highest to lowest. And using the most up-to-date data that we have available, 15 states have spent only 5% or less of their ERA1 allocation. The data used to update these spreadsheets comes from several different sources, including from real-time dashboards, program administrators, news articles, and the Department of Treasury. We try to use the most updated data available for each program to keep this count as current as possible. And next week, we will share with the new Treasury data that we're hoping will come out. We will share an update on how states are doing. Next slide. And if you know of any dashboards that aren't on our list, please feel free to send the link over to research@nlihc.org. And additionally, if you have any comments or questions about the data, please reach out as well. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Emma. I'm glad you ended right where you did, because we just had a question about exactly that, about how communities can get their community included in the tracking. So as Emma said, please send, if you know of dashboards, if you're managing a dashboard, send it to this email list that's on the screen, or any other information that you have about your local ERA program. We are very interested in knowing, so please do be in touch, and thanks. There was a question that I just want to quickly give a clarification to. There was a question about recapturing at the end of September, asking what Treasury will do with the power of the Secretary to recoup funds if 65% is not spent by September 30th. So just as a quick clarification there, what the statute says is that communities who have spent 65% of their funds, they are eligible to have some funds reallocated to them. But the Department of Treasury has not yet put out definitions or guidance on how they will determine which communities they'll be recapturing funds from, and how they'll do the reallocation process. And we'll talk about this more on our next national call, because we have some ideas and some suggestions that we're going to make to Treasury on how they should use that recapture ability in a way that further incentivizes communities to do more in spending the money and getting its tenants who need it, and ensuring that it's done in a way that does not harm tenants in that community that need assistance. And we welcome your ideas and your input on those suggestions that we'll make to the Department of Treasury. So we'll talk about that more on our next call. And it's time to end this one. So thank you again all for joining today's call. A reminder that we will be keeping a close eye and ear out for any response by the Supreme Court on the CDC Eviction Moratorium. So as soon as we have any information on that, we'll be sending an e-blast out to our full network, along with immediate actions that we'll ask all of you to take. And in the meantime, again, please sign your organization onto our HoUSed campaign letter, and we will be sending it up to the Hill shortly. So thank you all so much for your participation. Take care, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.